Thank you, Penny. Thank you, Howard. And it's nice to see everybody. It's a talk that I started some time ago when I was in Kingston for the Antique Society there. And I gradually adapted it more to make it more botanical. So it's a new experience to speak on Zoom, because usually when I give a talk or a lecture, I'm looking around the audience to make sure nobody's falling asleep, hoping people are not nodding and smiling. But aside from 2 or 3 of you, I just can't see any faces. So here we go. Why did I choose antique gardens? I found a rather useful quotation which summed it up for me, and maybe for many of you. I think we're all interested in the traditions that came before us. So we, as we look at our own gardens, draw inspiration from the past. And for garden design, another quote that I rather liked, where the artistry of humans meets the beauty of nature. So we're manipulating nature. Sometimes we're fighting it, I think. So let's look at some very early gardens. This is an Egyptian garden from 1450 BC, one of the earliest pictures I could find. And it's fairly typical of most early gardens. Everything's very squared off, symmetrical. These trees are in neat rows. These are water gardens. They're all square. So it's there's nothing very natural about it, but it has a satisfaction because it's orderly and it's beautiful, and I'm sure it was very well kept. That style is still in use today. You know, recognize this as it's the kitchen garden in Bellevue House in Kingston. They've got vegetables plots all laid out in squares, just like the old type of garden. So where did gardening begin? As far as I could find out, the earliest gardens were not based on aesthetics or beauty. They were almost certainly based on the need for food, and probably went back at least 10,000 BC. We all needed food, and it started off with hunting and gathering, and then gradually people started to enclose certain areas to grow things, probably to keep off animals and marauders. And then they began to select the desirable plants, or what we now call cultivation. Some of the earliest plants in cultivation I found are the humble fig. The earliest evidence for this in the Middle East, 11,000 years ago. I don't think the figs looked like that then. We've cultivated them and then selected them, but as a fruit, it was cultivated very, very early. And similarly, the olive. This olive tree itself is 5,000 years old, but it goes back much further than that. And finally, from the wild grape, we cultivated the grape initially for food and later on, of course, for wine. I don't know how they discovered that grapes made good wine, but I'm not complaining about that. So after this initial period of cultivating plants for food, the cultivation for aesthetic reasons began still quite early, about the 16th century BC. That first picture I showed you was about that period. And in those days, it was the purview of the well-to-do. The ordinary people did not grow gardens for aesthetic reasons. They grew them for food. So some very early evidence from Egyptian tomb paintings. This is very much like the one I showed you at the beginning with the square water garden and the rows of trees, very symmetrical. So this is some of the earliest evidence of ornamental horticultural landscape design. It may appeal to you, it may not, but it certainly is, it has a certain satisfaction. And there are many pieces of evidence of gardens in ancient Egypt. And here you see a worker, and I'm suspecting that the people who enjoyed these gardens actually didn't get out there in their dirty old jeans and boots. They had people to do the gardening for them. So here's a very famous garden, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. They're not hanging, they're actually terraced, and there's a lot of water. Now, Babylon is in a desert, so when this was built, it required something like 8,000 gallons of water a day to keep it going. However, there's some controversy about whether this actually existed. It's one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and it's the only one that we're not quite sure about. There's no evidence of any remnants of this building in Babylon. The reports of it, the drawings, and the writings about it came several hundred years later than 600 BC. And the legend has that Nebuchadnezzar built it for his wife, who was homesick. A lot of research has gone into this, and it's never really been resolved, but it turns out that possibly there was a garden like this, but it actually was about 300 miles north of Babylon in what is now Iraq. So you can read about this online. It's certainly an interesting story, but I can't tell you whether it's true or not. Let's move over into other parts of Asia now. India also developed gardens several hundred years BC, and we find Hindu texts with illustrations of gardens. And again, you see the symmetry with the plants. You see structures, which are part of many old gardens. And this is, in the Hindu texts, there are accounts of bamboo groves that were given to Buddha. The inscriptions from 268 BC mention the establishment of botanical gardens in India. And this was mainly for medicinal plants and trees, not too much mention of beauty. So there again, you see structures, you see very regular rows of plants, and nothing sort of flowing like a modern garden. And in India, there's still many gardens that follow this rather rigid design, quite beautiful, quite symmetrical, lots of water, lots of structures, fountains, sculptures, and so on. So this is repeated even today. Moving along to parts of Europe, the Greeks and the Romans, of course, they had their gardens. We haven't got a lot of detailed description, but Homer had a description, and this will sound familiar to gardeners, I think. Nature is an enemy, and taming her involves cultivation. Fences are often related to vineyards. So the things I mentioned at the beginning, the enclosures and cultivation, are brought up in Homer's writing here. And Alexander the Great, a little bit later, he found gardens in Persia and brought them back to Greece. Here's some of the typical classical Greek gardens. We're still looking at tremendous symmetry. We're looking at water flow. We're looking at structures, and the incorporation of water and urns is fairly consistent in the gardens of Greece. The Romans took the concept from Greece of the peristyle, which is a courtyard, and then they transformed the actual central courtyard from a hard surface into a garden. And this is a peristyle in the house of Veti, which was just into AD, 79 AD. when the Romans were at their peak. Now here's a Roman garden that actually survived to this day. This is the Villa Adriana in the Tivoli Gardens. Again, you see the use of symmetry, you see the use of structures, water. The Tivoli Gardens are an amazing example of hydraulic engineering. There are 9 stages of the garden. I know I walked down, I had to walk back up as well. And there are various water gardens that come on and play at certain times. And this is all based on an underground hydraulic system. It's quite remarkable. And it has been retained and protected to this day. And this is one of the few antique gardens that I went to. This is the fountains play at a certain time of day in this particular area. And along here you see gargoyles, each spouting out water at certain periods. So I was privileged to see the real thing for the Tivoli Gardens, and believe me, it's absolutely magnificent. Of course, it's in a wonderful setting and a wonderful climate as well in Rome. So moving into a little bit later into the medieval period, again, we're seeing symmetry, but now we're seeing a sort of something a little bit more elaborate in this sort of topiary type of garden where the individual hedges are trimmed to symmetrical shapes or shapes resembling other objects. Again, it isn't everybody's taste, but it's a pretty remarkable achievement. So in Europe, the cultivation of herbs began, and this was often, as you probably know, in conjunction with monasteries. So the monks would plant the herbs and the medicinal plants, and they kept the style of the Roman and Greek peristyle, again a square. So let's look at some of those. This is actually a copy of that style. It was recreated in 1966. But many monastery gardens exist from the medieval time, and they've been kept. They've been kept trimmed and planted. So here's a typical square, got monastery garden. The cloisters would be around here where the monks would walk. And these various beds would have herbs and special medicinal plants in. And they also had ornamental structures as well, like fountains and probably religious sculptures as well. As I said, a lot of these courtyards and cloisters are still maintained today. And some of them, this is another one from Rome where I went in about 3 years ago. And then in England, I haven't even talked about England yet, but Physic Gardens, they were called in England, the gardens where the monks grew the medicinal plants. And they were very popular in the 17th century in England. And this particular one in Chelsea, in London, exists to this day. I was there in 2002. And again, you see the square beds. They don't have cloisters because it's not part of a monastery. But these have been tended over the centuries, and it's a walled garden. And it's like a little haven in the middle of the noisy part of London. You go in and this quiet little garden with these order beds. And when I was working in London University many years ago, there was I was giving classes in Imperial College, which is in Kensington, and we used to get our specimens for teaching the botany classes from the Physic Garden and the greenhouses that were associated So it was quite a treat. The day before the lab, I would come over to the Physic Garden and get my specimens, and then glory in walking through this wonderful atmosphere of a 17th century garden. Around that time, medicinal plants became popular, and you can find many online now, and they were published in what were called herbals, pages and pages of detailed descriptions, usually extremely accurately botanically. The prints that you can buy now are just a delight. And this is from Coller's Medicinal Plants. There are many others. I just love these pictures. I have some in my house. They're scientific, but at the same time, they have a beauty of their own, I think. So let's move into the Renaissance, or the Renaissance, however you pronounce it. Italy was renowned for its Renaissance gardens. Well, they still incorporated balance and plantings and hedges and statuary, and sometimes those statues were religious symbols. So here's a few gardens from, pictures of gardens from the Renaissance in Italy. Again, very symmetrical, and here's the carefully carved hedges from these pictures are from the 16th century. But modern gardens still use this style. This is a picture from Connecticut, actually, and it's mimicking the style of the Renaissance gardens with the rows of hedges, the carefully symmetrical plots, and the hard surfaces. And I'm sure, although you can't see it, it incorporates statuary as well. You can see the columns here in these garden structures. And this is a modern interpretation of a 16th century Italian garden in England. A lot of well-to-do people would mimic the structures. And again, lots of square corners, lots of water. And there are actually terraces going down here, which I couldn't get in the picture. So it's another way that we're mimicking and perhaps admiring the symmetry and the elegance of the Italian Renaissance gardens. Just a quick word about topiary. This is an example of the way they carved up the hedges and the trees. And of course, topiary still exists today. And this is a modern topiary, a squirrel, who we could all easily recognize and maybe would like to chop down. Still in Europe, looking at the history of French gardens, French, not surprisingly, were similar to the Italian Renaissance gardens, and possibly the most famous European garden. I'm sure you all know what this is. Just repeating the angles, the structure, the feet, and the hard surfaces. And this, of course, is the gardens of the Palace of Versailles, created in the 17th century, some of the largest formal gardens ever created. And I thought this was kind of interesting. These statues along this walkway reminded me of the picture that I showed you of the gardens in Italy, the Tivoli Gardens, which date back much, much earlier. But people like straight lines, and they like statues, and they like neatness. One shudders to think what it cost in terms of well, I suppose French francs and sweat and toil to keep these things immaculate as they were. Also in France, I wonder if you recognize this. Well, another very famous garden. This is Monet's garden, one of Monet's gardens, and he departed completely from the symmetry and the style of the Renaissance. And of course, it's a little bit later, but things were beginning to relax slightly. Not everybody thought Monet's gardens were beautiful. A bit like when the Impressionist painters came in, you know, they weren't accepted immediately. It was a new style, something more relaxed, perhaps, less formal. So, but now, of course, Monet's paintings are treasured, and I think we all love those. Now, I have to move into Asia briefly and talk to you a little bit about the history of Chinese and Japanese Oriental gardens. It started mainly in the 1st century AD, and they're quite different from the extensive use of greenery and statuary and symmetry, and simplicity is the word, and serenity. And there's a great deal of use of stone elements and water in the Oriental gardens. Also, the type of buildings, of course, this also evokes the Chinese gardens. And here's a very simple garden with a Buddhist garden with just almost no plants, a few stones carefully placed. But I think if you've ever been into these gardens, you can understand the serenity that it evokes and how completely different it is from the gardens I've described so far. And yet, I've always said you can have a garden anywhere. I think you can have a garden in any style. And this is just another very interesting trend. And the ultimate is the Zen Garden, which actually has no plants at all. It's a contemplative place. And the description of Zen gardens is the art of setting stones. And there you go. Okay, I grew up in England, and England is well known for its gardens. And early English gardens, some of them still survive, mimicked the Renaissance styles from Europe. But also, there was a trend in the 18th century of something completely different, maybe a bit like the Impressionist paintings that I mentioned. Capability Brown, he was called, Lancelot. He was what we'd now call a landscape designer, and he designed over 170 gardens from the finest country houses in Britain. But he departed from the formal gardens, and for quite a while it was not appreciated. The gardens that he designed look very natural. They're not, of course, they're manicured just like our gardens, but he went in for losing the formal shape. He still has statues and water, but he has flowing lines, and he has, it's not rigid at all. And many of his gardens imitated the English countryside. But of course, as I said, they were manicured. He did, because they were constructed. But he brought in a completely new style of gardens in England. So we're gradually getting more and more informality. And the ultimate, probably starting in England and certainly here now, is the cottage garden. This isn't a very good picture in terms of focus. I think it's a bit misty, but then it's often foggy in England anyway. So this is a fairly typical old English house with the walk up to the door, and then a mass of what looks like disorganized, casually growing flowers. Of course, it's not. Like all gardens, it's organized, it's manicured, but it has a style of its own. And to some extent, I think a lot of us mimic that style now. I certainly do in my garden, within the limits of the climate that we have. And one of the characteristic things of English gardens, of course, is the rose. And I tried to find out how roses came to be, and I found from quite early, 20th, about the 2nd century, that the rose certainly existed then in these tombs in Egypt. So these are actual rose. This has been reconstructed from the pieces that were found in the excavations of the tomb. So the roses go back a long way too. So what will the antique gardens look like of tomorrow? I was just thinking, you know, people look back on what we've got now. Will things change? And I found that one of the antiques in England are the old red phone boxes. You know, the telephone boxes, which may be familiar to some of you. They're now, because of cell phones and so on, those smelly old phone boxes that I grew up with are a thing of the past, but they've become collector's items. And here's one. They've repurposed this telephone box as a planter. And so I thought, well, this may be one of the antiques of tomorrow. Just to sum up, now we incorporate many of the aspects of antique designs in our gardens, and we can still get statuary. You can get a statue from of the goddess of love. You can get that for about $160 from Wayfair, or you can buy a real old pot for probably $2,000 or $3,000 from an antique dealer. And so it mimics some of the things we've learned from the past. We bring some of the ideas into our modern gardens. And last but not least, the garden gnome. Thank you very much.